He hurled a cup of filthy water into my face while people watched and laughed, because to them I was just a homeless old woman not worth dignity, not worth decency. But what they didn't know was that I used to hold the keys to their city's secrets, and I was about to remind them who I truly was. He threw the water straight into my face, icy, greasy, stinking, like it had been scooped from the bottom of a mop bucket. And he laughed so loud that people turned to look, then quickly turned away ashamed of the part of themselves that might have smirked too. I stood there on the corner of Kessler Square, drenched, blinking through rivulets running into my eyes, clutching my soaked canvas bag full of half-eaten muffins and yesterday's paper. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't raise a hand. I just looked up at him, young, clean-cut, fancy wool coat and sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. And behind him, I saw her, a woman in a sharp red suit, hair tied back so tight it looked like her face might crack if she smiled, clutching a clipboard like it was a crown. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the man with approval, like he'd just taken out the trash. I'm not sure what hit harder, the water or the realization that I had become someone people felt entitled to humiliate. I am Eleanor May Hollis, 68 years old, former librarian, widow, and, as of 3 years ago, homeless. Not that anyone in this neighborhood cares who I was. Around here, I'm the old bat with the shopping cart, the grandma who talks to pigeons, the crazy witch who sleeps behind the bus station. What they don't know is that I was once the one who helped their children find books, who baked casseroles for PTA meetings, who stayed up late proofreading college essays for kids who weren't even mine. What they don't see is that I still have a photo of my husband in my pocket, folded so many times the corners have frayed into feathers. What they forget is that I was someone before I became someone they chose to forget. That morning had started like most. I woke under the eaves of the closed-up ice cream shop, brushed my teeth in the gas station bathroom, and tied my scarf the way Walter used to like. I always try to look decent. Just because life is cruel doesn't mean I have to be. I picked up a day-old coffee from Hank at the corner stand. He always pretends he's out of change so he can give it to me for free. I nodded at little Luis as he walked to school in his oversized backpack. He always waves. His smile is the only one I see most days. Then I made my way to the square, to my usual bench beneath the busted street lamp. That's when I saw the man and the woman arguing about parking. I didn't think anything of it. I've seen hundreds of arguments on that corner. But then he turned, saw me, and something lit up behind his eyes, a twisted amusement, a sense of purpose. "Get a job, you old leech," he shouted before picking up the half-full cup from the sidewalk trash bin. The water hit me before the words fully registered. Everyone saw. No one moved, except for her, the woman in red. She took out her phone and took a picture. Of me. Not of him. Not of what he did. Of me. Drenched. Still. Powerless. It was then I noticed her badge clipped to her blazer. HOA Board. President. Of course. That was when the cold left my skin and settled into my bones, not from the water, but from the humiliation. The way the whole world seemed to agree that I deserved it. The man walked off like a hero, brushing his hands as though they were dirty from touching air I had breathed. She followed, not a single glance back. I sat on the bench, dripping my scarf plastered to my face, and realized something terrifying. I had started to believe them. That I was invisible, that I was disposable, that I didn't matter. But then Luis came back. He ran all the way from the school gate. "Miss Eleanor," he whispered, offering his tiny sweater. "Are you okay?" I looked into his eyes, those big brown eyes that still saw me, that still believed I was someone worth running to, and something cracked. Not in a painful way, but in the way a shell breaks before something alive comes out. I didn't know it yet, but that splash was the beginning of something bigger than shame. It was the last time I would ever let someone throw water in my face and walk away laughing, because I remembered who I was, and I was going to make damn sure they remembered too. I wasn't always this shadow wrapped in blankets. I wasn't always the woman people stepped over like a crack in the sidewalk. Once upon a time, before cardboard beds and councilwoman sneers, I was Eleanor May Hollis, the woman with the corner house and the yellow shutters, the warm cinnamon rolls on Saturday mornings, the voice that could hush a classroom of kindergartners with just a smile. My life was made of tiny rituals of handwritten notes and backyard gardenias, of jazz records on rainy nights, and the steady voice of my husband reading aloud from the paper. Walter, God, I loved that man. He had the softest eyes I'd ever seen on a truck driver gray, always a little tired, but never unkind. He called me Ellie even when I was mad at him, even when the world was falling apart. We met in a library, fittingly. He couldn't find the biography section. I couldn't find the nerve to say no when he asked if I wanted coffee. A year later, we were married under a weeping willow in Southgate Park, and I was wearing my grandmother's lace gloves. We had 34 years together. 34 years of dishes and disagreements and dancing barefoot in the kitchen after too much wine. And then one day he just didn't come back from work. The highway called him home faster than I could. A tire, a flash of light, and then emptiness. It was like someone pulled the floor out from under me but left the house standing. I still had my job at the library. I still had our bed, his chair, the sticky note he left on the fridge that morning that read, "Don't forget to smile, Ellie, but grief is a thief. Quiet, patient, cruel." It took my joy, my routines, my strength. And then, 2 years later, it took my job. Budget cuts, they said. Downsizing. And just like that, the woman who spent her life helping others find stories couldn't find her own way out. I sold the car, then the jewelry, then the furniture. I tried to rent out the house, but the bank wanted more than I could offer. The foreclosure letter came on my birthday. I packed what I could carry in a suitcase and locked the door to my life one final time. I wandered for a while shelters, bus stops, even the back room of a friendly laundromat once. I learned which corners were safest, which alleys stayed dry. I learned that people don't look you in the eye when you sleep on the sidewalk. I learned that silence is armor, that invisibility can be mistaken for peace. But I never lost my name. Even when they called me bag lady crackpot or just muttered curses under their breath, I whispered my name to myself every morning. Eleanor May Hollis. As if saying it out loud tethered me to something real. The bench at Kessler Square became my station. I chose it because of the view it faced the bakery across the street, and sometimes if the door opened wide enough, I could smell cinnamon and hope. I liked watching people walk by, imagining their lives like chapters I'd never get to read. That's how I saw her the first time. Madeline Brinks, the woman in red. The HOA president who acted like God handed her a deed to the entire block. She walked like the sidewalk owed her something. Her heels clicked like gunfire. She never looked at the people picking cans from trash bins, unless she was filing a complaint about them. Madeline didn't know me. Not really, but she saw me. And not in the way Louise saw me with curiosity and kindness, but in that sharp way people see a stain on an expensive rug. She hated that I was there. I didn't belong in her aesthetic, her curated community of potted plants and shiny Teslas. I ruined the illusion. And so she started her campaign quiet at first. Someone accidentally threw out my blankets. A posted sign appeared overnight, no loitering. Bench use limited to 15 minutes. Then came the threats, HOA fines, for business owners who encouraged vagrancy. Even Hank at the coffee stand got a visit, but I stayed, not out of defiance at first, out of exhaustion, until the splash, until that smug man in his garbage water, until I saw Madeline take that picture and smirk. That was the first time I didn't just feel pain. I felt rage, because I realized that somewhere in the shuffle of loss and loneliness, I had forgotten that I had a spine, that I had a story, and that no one was going to end my chapter like that. So that night, after Louise hugged me and ran back to class, I sat down and took out a pen. A cheap hotel pen, half dried, but it worked. I borrowed a crumpled napkin from my bag and began to write. Not a journal, not a letter, a list. People who've wronged me, people who've helped, facts, laws, things I remember from the library about rights and councils and city codes. And at the top I wrote, "This is not how my story ends, because my name is Eleanor, and I wasn't always homeless, and I will not be forgotten. They say cruelty wears many masks, but the one he wore that day wasn't a mask at all. It was his real face, polished, proud, pleased with himself." He strutted across Kessler Square like he owned the pavement, not a scuff on his designer shoes, not a thought in his head that what he did might echo through someone else's bones for weeks. I remember every detail of him. The tailored navy suit that didn't wrinkle even when he threw the water. The gleaming wristwatch he kept adjusting as if even time itself was under his command. His hair slicked back, not a strand out of place, and those sunglasses. God, those mirrored sunglasses, so I couldn't see his eyes when he smirked at me like I was gum stuck to the curb. He never gave his name, but I would come to learn it later. Oh yes, the man who threw water in my face would become the man whose name I would whisper before the city council. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That day, he walked away after his little performance, leaving me soaked and shamed beneath a sky that didn't care. I sat there for hours, drying in the breeze, feeling the sting not of water, but of being made into a spectacle. He didn't throw that water to make a point. He did it for applause. He was a developer, I would soon learn. Derek Langford, owner of LFG Capital. Those fancy signs going up all over the district, coming soon. Luxury condos. I started seeing his face everywhere, once I knew what to look for. On posters, on websites, in smiling ribbon-cutting photos beside Madeline Brinks. They were the golden pair, power and money. HOA and corporate. Neighborhood queen and urban king. And I was the blemish on their brochure. I began to watch them. From my bench. From behind parked cars. From the alley beside Benny's florist. I didn't stalk, I observed. The way I used to observe stories unfold inside library books. I took notes. I paid attention. I became invisible, but this time by choice. Derek Langford came to Kessler Square every Tuesday around noon. Met Madeline outside the cafe with the iron chairs. They would talk in hushed tones, leaning close, sometimes laughing. But it wasn't warm laughter. It was the kind of laugh that pushes others lower so you can feel taller. One day I saw her hand him a folder. He didn't open it, just slid it under his arm like he already knew what was inside. Something about that shook me. I began to speak to people quietly. Hank, the coffee vendor. Rosa, who cleans at the law firm down the street. Pastor James, who runs the food pantry 2 blocks away. They all had stories about permits that got denied, about shop windows suddenly shattered, about fines appearing out of nowhere. Derek Langford's name came up more than once, always followed by a hush. "He's untouchable," Rosa whispered one night, handing me a hot roll. "The city bends for him." And Madeline. She sweeps the sidewalk for his feet. But I didn't care how tall he stood, because I had started to stand again, too. It began with the pigeons. Silly, I know, but they always gathered near my bench. And one morning I saw Derek pause as he passed, wrinkle his nose and mutter, "Filthy birds." I laughed out loud. He turned, confused, insulted that the crazy old woman dared to find humor in his disdain. "They're smarter than you think," I said. "They remember faces, especially the cruel ones." That night, I opened the binder I had pieced together from trash can finds and charity bins. Blank paper, half-used notebooks, napkins, even receipts. I wrote Langford, LFG, HOA collusion, harassment incidents. I made a chart. I drew lines. I highlighted dates. I connected the dots. I may not have had a roof, but I had a mind, and it was waking up from a long, sorrowful sleep. The next Tuesday, I followed Derek not too close, just far enough. I watched him slip into a black sedan. I saw the driver hand him a tablet. He scrolled through something, paused, smiled. Probably looking at another property he'd demolished to put up luxury boxes no one could afford. But what I noticed was the license plate. Custom, DLFG1. And that was enough, because with a name, a plate, and a pattern, I had a thread. And if there's one thing a librarian knows how to do, it's pull a thread until the whole facade unravels. You see, Derek Langford wasn't just a man with a smirk. He was a man with secrets, and I was going to find every single one of them. You'd be surprised what you can build from scraps. People think homelessness is about nothingness, about absence, but it's not. It's about survival. It's about collecting pieces. An old newspaper becomes insulation. A plastic bag becomes a rain shield. A milk crate becomes a table. Every item has purpose. Every night you survive becomes a lesson in adaptation. You learn to hear the difference between footsteps that pass and footsteps that stop. You learn what kindness costs. You learn that shame weighs more than hunger, but it can be carried if you keep moving. But what they never saw beneath the cardboard and the layers of clothes I wore like armor was the mind that never dulled. The dignity that refused to die. The woman who remembered Dewey Decimal numbers better than her own Social Security. Every day after Derek Langford's splash, I returned to the square like clockwork. Not to sit, not to beg, but to watch, to record, to reclaim the space where I had been humiliated. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming identity, about making noise in a world that had grown used to tuning me out. I began organizing. Quietly. Subtly. I made small talk with Hank at the cart, letting slip that I remembered his father's World War II medals were missing after HOA inspectors came by. I asked Rosa about the citations she received for unsanitary conditions. Outside, the firm's citations dated 2 days before the inspection even happened. They started to listen. Turns out there were many of us people Derek and Madeline had steamrolled over in the name of neighborhood beautification and urban renewal. Business owners fined into silence. Tenants pushed out through noise complaints and rent hikes. Food truck vendors suddenly banned from their regular spots. They never connected the dots, but I did. I laid them all out beneath the flickering light at the shelter's back room, a map of quiet injustices. Patterns emerged. Dates aligned. Permits revoked after council meetings. Properties condemned just before Derek's company swooped in with cash offers. HOA complaints disappearing when donors stepped in. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth power protects power. They never expected someone like me to notice. They never thought the woman mumbling to pigeons would also be quoting city ordinances from memory. But that's the danger of ignoring the quiet ones. We don't disappear. We sharpen. There was one moment, one that still plays in my mind when I knew this was more than personal. A teenager approached me one afternoon. Long, hoodie-guarded eyes. Said his name was Marcus. His family used to rent above the bakery. They got evicted after a noise complaint. His mother worked 2 jobs. His little sister had asthma and nowhere warm to sleep now. He showed me a notice stamped by HOA lawyers signed by Madeline Brinks. He didn't cry, but his hands shook. "I heard you're keeping track," he said. "Can I help?" And just like that, the circle grew. It wasn't just me. It was all of us, those flattened by the system, erased by bureaucracy, discarded like yesterday's headlines. We began gathering in the alley behind the florist in shifts, pretending to smoke or eat or just loiter. But really, we were building something stronger than shelter a case. I taught them how to document, how to file FOIA requests, how to cross-reference property ownership with campaign donations. We built a paper trail with no funding, no degrees, no titles, only truth. But still, I was just a homeless woman. No one would believe me alone. I knew that, so I made a decision. I was going to break invisibility. One Sunday morning, I walked into the HOA's monthly public meeting at the community center. My coat was patched but clean. My scarf freshly ironed. I borrowed a cane from Pastor James, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me to stand tall. The room went quiet. All eyes turned. Whispers flitted like flies. I walked past them all straight to the mic. "Name," the secretary asked reluctantly. "Eleanor May Hollis," I said. "Resident of this city for 42 years. Displaced, not disappeared." Madeline looked up from her clipboard, startled. Derek sat beside her in a gray suit, staring through me. "I have evidence," I said, "that this HOA has collaborated with private developers to force low-income tenants and small business owners out of this district. Evidence of procedural misconduct, fraudulent complaints, coordinated harassment." A pause, then laughter. From Derek, from a few others. The kind that echoes in courtrooms and boardrooms and gated communities. But then I lifted my bag and pulled out the binder. Thick, dog-eared, labeled, indexed. "I suggest you listen, because next time it won't be a meeting. It'll be a courtroom." And for the first time, Derek's smirk flickered. They didn't know it yet. But the storm had already begun. I didn't sleep the night after that meeting. Not because I was cold or hungry or afraid, though I was all 3, but because for the first time in years, I felt something flickering inside me that I thought had long been extinguished. Purpose. A strange, trembling clarity. Like a compass long buried under snow finally twitching north. That meeting didn't change their minds. Of course it didn't. Derek Langford scoffed. Madeline Brinks rolled her eyes, and the rest of them offered that kind of oily silence that powerful people use when they think you'll exhaust yourself soon enough. But the room had shifted. A few heads had turned. A few neighbors had whispered to each other. And one man, Paul Finley, who owned the corner bookstore, had slipped me a note as I stepped down from the mic. They tried to shut me down last year. Let me know how I can help. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just rising for myself anymore. I was rising for every person they'd tried to push down. I started walking with intention. No more slouched shoulders. No more avoiding eye contact. I began speaking to people by name. "Morning, Carla," I'd say to the florist. "How's your ankle, Ben?" to the mailman. I became a presence again. Not a ghost, not a shadow. I filed formal complaints to the city council. I mailed certified letters handwritten because I didn't have a computer, citing violations dates, affidavits from residents. When they ignored me, I escalated. Luis's school teacher invited me to speak during Civic Awareness Week. Imagine that a homeless woman in front of 6th graders pointing to a whiteboard, explaining due process and local governance like I was still wearing pearls and running storytime back in the library. The kids clapped. Some parents cried. One reporter from the East Point Tribune sat in the back silent. 3 days later, an article appeared on page 3, displaced not defeated one woman's fight against urban erasure. They spelled my name wrong, but it didn't matter. The phones started ringing. A lawyer named Miriam Baines called the food pantry asking if I was real. When we met, she was young, sharp, full of something I'd almost forgotten: outrage without fear. She offered to help, pro bono, said the city had long needed someone willing to crack the shell around the HOA's unchecked power. Together, we compiled the files. Miriam filed a formal petition to freeze any HOA decisions affecting evictions and permits pending investigation. The city clerk, to everyone's surprise, approved the temporary hold. And just like that, Madeline's clipboard lost its bite. But Derek Langford, he didn't blink. He doubled down. New flyers went up around the square. Keep our community clean. Say no to vagrancy. They showed a photo of someone asleep on a bench with the face blurred, but the scarf unmistakable. Mine. The same afternoon, I found my sleeping spot trashed, my bag slashed open, my few possessions ruined. On the brick wall behind me, someone had spray-painted "Crawl back under your rock." I stood there, shaking the pieces of my life scattered like broken bones. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt it again. That old, heavy grief that had followed Walter's funeral, that had clung to me like a second skin when the house key no longer worked. But then I remembered Luis. I remembered Marcus. I remembered the 6th graders clapping. I remembered the sound of my own voice at the microphone, steady, clear, unafraid. So I sat down right there in the wreckage. I picked up the binder. The papers were wet ink, running like tears. But the truth was still there. They could destroy my things, but they couldn't destroy what I had become. That night, I stood on the steps of City Hall during a town forum. Not inside, outside. With a microphone someone had lent me and a crowd of 50 people, most of whom I didn't even know. I told my story. I showed them the photos. I read the violations aloud. I named names. I saw curtains part in the windows above. I saw phones recording. I saw people listening. And that's when Derek Langford stepped out of his black car. He didn't yell. He didn't smirk. He just stared silent, calculating. I looked him in the eye. "I remember you. I said into the microphone. But do you remember me? Do you remember what you did? Because now everyone else will. The crowd fell silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. And just like that, the night lit up with the sound of rising. It wasn't just me anymore. We were all standing now, and there was no going back. They always say, never underestimate the quiet ones, but people like Derek Langford and Madeline Brinks never truly believed that. Not until I handed them a storm wrapped in footnotes. Not until I turned their silence into noise. Not until they realized I wasn't a weak old woman begging for scraps. I was the librarian who once archived every city charter from 1950 to 2000. I was the widow who sat through budget hearings for fun. I was the memory they forgot could bite back. It happened on a Thursday. Rainy, gray-skied, the kind of day when people usually hurry past whatever doesn't benefit them. But not this time. I had submitted a formal complaint to the Ethics and Compliance Committee citing misappropriation of HOA authority collusion with private development firms and discriminatory targeting of unhoused individuals. To most people, it was just a stack of paper. To me, it was 48 pages of reckoning. But it wasn't the paperwork that caused the twist. It was what was inside it, something I had found buried deep in city archives during one of my long, quiet hours at the public terminal in the East Point Library, using a guest pass and pretending to be no one. It was a land deed. More specifically, it was a copy of the original zoning agreement from 1987 that governed Kessler Square. Back then, the land had been donated by a retired judge whose dying wish was that the space be preserved for community use, accessible to all, especially those without homes. And yet, here we were with Derek building luxury condos on half the lot, and Madeline finding food trucks for aesthetic disruptions. The clause had never been amended, never legally revoked. It was still active, still binding. They broke the law. I didn't need a title or a badge. I had the truth, and it came notarized. Miriam's eyes widened when she read it. You realize this changes everything, she asked. I do, I said. And so will they. We went public. Not just with the documents, but with the story. The whole story. From Walter's accident to the eviction, to the splash of water that started it all. The newspaper reprinted the article this time on the front page. The headline read, "She slept on a bench." Now she's taking down the HOA. Photos followed. Interviews. A viral clip of me at the city steps saying, "You cannot bulldoze people's dignity." That's when Derek made his move. He called a press conference. Suited up. Slick, smile in place. He leaned on a podium and told the world that I was mentally unstable, that I fabricated documents, and that I was exploiting a community's sympathy for personal fame. He didn't know the cameras were already rolling when Luis stepped onto the stage beside me, holding a photo of his old building. She gave me her sandwich when I had no lunch, he said into the microphone, voice trembling but proud. She's not lying. They are. Then came Marcus, then Hank, then Pastor James. One by one, the people they had tried to silence stood beside me. A living wall of testimony. And then came the final blow. I pulled out a check. $100,000. Anonymous donation. Earmarked for a community legal aid fund. What no one knew, what I hadn't even told Miriam yet, was that I'd inherited a bond Walter had set aside decades ago, locked in a safe deposit box at the bank. I'd never touched it. Not once. I was saving it for a rainy day. Well, it was pouring. You're homeless, someone whispered as I signed the check. No, I said. I was. But today I have more shelter than they do because I have a community. The ethics committee launched an investigation the next morning. The mayor's office issued a statement. City inspectors walked through Derek's developments, and for the first time I saw Madeline Brinks without her clipboard. She stood at the edge of the square, watching people gather not to protest, but to plant flowers, to repaint benches, to give out food. She looked smaller somehow, like a throne without a crown. I walked up to her, quietly, calmly. "You never knew who I was," I said. She looked at me, eyes soft but lost. "No, I didn't." And I nodded, but I always did, because I was never just a nobody. I was Eleanor May Hollis, librarian, widow, fighter, voice for the voiceless. And my story wasn't a tragedy. It was a revolution in paperback. The sky was open the day everything changed, not like a storm, not like judgment, but like a sigh of release after a long-held breath. It had rained through the night, soft and cleansing, washing the grime from the square and leaving the pavement glistening like polished stone. When I stepped out from the shelter that morning, I carried no blanket, no cart, no binder, just my scarf around my shoulders, Walter's photo in my coat pocket, and the steady breath of someone who knew she had done what needed to be done. They called it the People's Assembly, an impromptu gathering that turned into something bigger. The city had installed a platform in Kessler Square, not for developers or mayors, but for us, for the ones who lived there, walked its corners, felt its cracks. And there I stood in front of neighbors who once looked through me, people who had passed me with averted eyes, now gathered in a circle of warmth and remembrance. Hank handed out coffee without charging. Marcus adjusted the speaker cords. Little Luis waved a flag he'd drawn himself, blue crayon skies and a bench surrounded by smiling faces. I stepped up. My cane tapped once against the wood, not for balance, but for punctuation. "I used to live on that bench," I said into the mic, my voice steady, clear. "And I thought that made me less than you. I thought silence was survival. But I was wrong. Silence is surrender. And we are not surrendering anymore." Applause erupted, not polite, not rehearsed. Real, raw. Behind them, the banner read, "Kessler Square belongs to everyone." The city council had ruled in our favor. The zoning clause stood untouched and powerful. Derek Langford's development permit was revoked. Several of his past acquisitions were under review. And Madeline Brinks. She had resigned quietly the week before. No speech, no photo ops. Just a folded notice left at the HOA door. But we didn't celebrate her fall. That wasn't the point. We celebrated our rise. The funds from the anonymous donation, Walter's last gift, were used to create a small legal aid center for displaced families. The back room of the old library became the headquarters. We called it the Hollis Room, and they asked me to run it. So every morning I sit at the same desk I once shelved books from, a little older, a little worn but whole in a way that cardboard never allowed. Sometimes I still walk past the bench. It's cleaner now. Someone repainted it sky blue. A plaque is fixed to the side. It reads, "In honor of those we overlooked, may we never do so again." Luis visits often. He brings drawings. One of them hangs above my desk, me with a cape and a crown standing on top of the city, my scarf blowing like a flag. I laugh every time I see it. "You made me a queen," I once told him. "You already were," he replied. And maybe that's the truest thing anyone said. Because I never needed riches or walls or a microphone to be seen. I just needed to stand. Now I do more than that. I speak, I lead, I live. So if you're ever walking through Kessler Square, look past the storefronts. Look past the noise. You might see an old woman with a gentle smile and a spark in her eyes. That's me, Eleanor May Hollis. I was homeless once, but now I have a name, a voice, a family made of strangers who stood up. And finally, I am home, in a world that often walks past the broken, the silent, the unseen. We forget that behind every tattered coat and weathered face is a name, a story, and a soul still burning with worth. Homeless grandma insulted by man throwing water in her face. Public fury erupts was never just about revenge. It was about restoring dignity, about proving that truth when armed with courage can shake even the tallest thrones of power. Eleanor May Hollis reminded us all, you are not defined by where you sleep, but by what you rise to fight for. If this story moved you, click subscribe to stand with every voice that refuses to be silenced. Comment below. What would you have done if you witnessed that moment in the square? Let's talk about justice, about courage, about the power of one voice to wake a city. Because sometimes the loudest revolutions begin with the quietest women.